I would say it was somewhere around middle school or high school, because I don't have a recollection of watching this show previous to middle school, and I actually think it was probably closer to high school, which has no bearing, except for when you realize what show I'm going to talk about, you have to remember that I'm a child of the reruns. I wasn't born in the 70s. But MASH, whether you love the show, hate the show, or never seen the show, is a show that is situated in the Korean conflict. The 4077 was a field hospital where they bandaged and cared for those who had been injured in the conflict. And despite the circumstances, they did well to make as much comedy out of it as they could. In the middle of the compound is this signpost, because the reality is everybody that was there wanted to be anywhere but there. And so they had created the signpost that had directions back to anywhere. That may be Boston, their hometown. It may be Tokyo, a place where they would go on R&R. But they're always looking to get out and away from there. Makes sense. But the signpost helps us to understand where we are and where we want to be. We're in this series this morning. We're in week number 5 of the series, Big Picture. Because we realize that Easter is coming up in 3 weeks. And oftentimes, Easter is a big celebration, and rightly so, where we celebrate that Jesus in his death covered our sins and his resurrection offers us new life. But we tend to think of Easter as this standalone thing. And for some people, they show up at church on Easter, and they show up at church on Christmas, and I'm very grateful for the people that show up those 2 Sundays, and I'm grateful for the people that show up on the 50 other Sundays, and that are engaged in the life of the community that is the church. But we've done this series because we want to say Easter is not this happenstance thing that just kind of occurred. It's not that just time was rolling along and God looked down and was like, you know what, I should really step into that mess right about now. Hey, Jesus, why don't you hit the bullpen, throw a couple pitches, and then why don't you hit the mound? Why don't you go in there and do your thing, and we'll see what happens. No, we see throughout the Old Testament these signposts, these directional pointing signs that say something big is coming, and that something big that was coming was Jesus. The death and resurrection that we'll celebrate in three weeks is not just a standalone thing. Yes, it radically transforms the whole landscape, but God had been forecasting that, had been placing these signposts along the way. When we started the series, we saw how sin disrupted the fabric of this perfect creation, that God created humanity to live in right relationship with him, but because of the rebellion that we chose, that relationship was devastated. And we saw how God worked, even from those very first moments, to redeem that which was broken. Not by him. God didn't say, oh, I screwed this up. No, he said, I created this very good, and it's the rebellion of my people that I gave the opportunity to choose whether they fully worshiped me or whether they rejected me. All the way to the point where last week we saw where God led these people that he claimed as his people out of physical slavery, out of the land of Egypt. And that's where we'll pick up this morning in Exodus chapter 19. We're just about 3 months after what you heard Pastor Jael preach about in last week's sermon, where God, by his miraculous power, sets them free. God, in his ordained goodness, allowed for these plagues to showcase his power and his authority, so much so that when they got to the Red Sea and they freaked out and they thought, you know what, we're either going to die by the Egyptians or we're going to die in the Red Sea, and God said, hold up, there's a third way. He parts the water and they walk across, not with muddy boots, but Scripture says on dry land. Now I want you to process this just for a second, because I think sometimes, again, we read this passage that Jael led us through last week, and we think of the Israelite people as like 6 people, or maybe Community Covenant church size of people. Like, maybe there's like 100 people. Okay, they can handle that. And they go across the Red Sea on dry land. God can handle that for 100 people. No, you look at the estimates, and the low estimate is the entire. Like, it's just unfathomable to think about how that group of people set free out of Egypt, crossing into the Red Sea, walking and crossing on dry land, and then God leading them. And so this is where we pick up. About 3 months after this is where Exodus 19 will pick up for us this morning. Exodus 19, beginning in verse 1. It says, on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they had set out from Rephidim, the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Pause to remember that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these first 5 books of the Old Testament are written by Moses to this Israelite people as they begin to enter to the promised land, and he's looking back. How did we get in this situation? How did sin creep in? How did God provide? So Moses is writing this many years later, writing back to say, hey, remember 3 months after that? Where we were in the desert and we camped at the mountain. Verse 3, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. These are the first words that God gives Moses to speak to the Israelites after being led out of slavery, out of their junk hole into this freedom that he has given them. He says, tell this to the people. Remember how I cared for you. Remember how I provided for you. Remember what you saw. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. This morning we're going to talk about the law and how the law actually pointed to Jesus. Oftentimes when we read the New Testament, we get this condemned picture of the law. We get this bad taste about the law. But the reality is that when God gave the Israelites this law, it was a foretaste of what was to come through Jesus. Now, the law could not save them, we're going to see, but the law pointed to Jesus. And the law was given as a confirmation of the relationship that God had already established with his people, not a requirement. This is key to recognize where this happens. That Moses records this happening after God had reached into their story, after God had hauled them out of slavery, after God had stepped into their mess and provided for them, after God had set them completely free and said, you'll be my people. He says, now here are the provisions for the confirmation of this relationship that I want for you. Remember, I am the God who created you to have a relationship with me, and I'm stepping back into your mess to redeem you, to restore you, and these things that you are going to hear, these provisions are a confirmation of the relationship, not a requirement. This is not a requirement to get in good with God. This is a reality of this is who we are called to be. Those of you that have children, you know that you have certain parameters that you place for them. Like don't touch the hot stove. Don't play in the street. Why? Not because you're saying, hey, if you don't play in the street, then you'll prove that you are my child. No, you're saying, because you're my child and I love you, I'm putting these parameters around you. This is how this relationship will work. From the moment that sin entered the world, humanity was in desperate need of a rescue. From the moment that Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden, their disobedience fractured that perfect communion with God. And so out of this devastation, God has never moved. It has only been his humanity that has broken this. Yet even in judgment, God gave a promise to Adam and Eve, a foreshadowing of redemption, that one day a descendant of the woman would crush the serpent's head. We looked at that verse the first week. This promise set the stage for this grand narrative that God would restore what was lost. What he gives to us in this passage we're going to see this morning is a confirmation of the relationship that he has, not a requirement. Consider how the law functioned in Israel's daily life and what he provided for them. It has moral laws, it has civil laws, it has ceremonial laws. Oftentimes when we think about the law, we just think about the 10 Commandments, and that's part of it. But there was so much more. There were so much more provisions for how they were to interact with God and how they were to interact with each other. All of these pointing to Jesus showing up on the scene. When we read the New Testament, oftentimes we miss the fact that the law was supposed to reveal their need and their sinfulness so that they would trust more fully in God, so that they would bend their will to God. When Jesus shows up on the scene in Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. Don't think that I've come to all these things that you knew about this relationship that God gave you as a confirmation of this relationship." He says, I haven't come to abolish that. I haven't come to do away with that. He says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. See, the law wasn't inherently bad. The reason that God gave this law was a confirmation of the relationship that he had for them and to teach them how to live in relationship with him and to teach them how to live in relationship with one another. Jesus didn't reject the law. Instead, he fulfilled it in every requirement. Every moral command, every ceremonial practice, every prophetic foreshadowing found its completion in Jesus. Jesus lived the perfect, sinless life that none of us could live. He became the ultimate sacrificial lamb, offering himself once and for all to atone for sin. Hold on to that word atone, because that becomes a key as we look at the law. Friends, the reality is that the law was temporary. It wasn't meant to be this thing that continued into perpetuity. It wasn't this thing that was meant to continue forever. But the law was meant to reveal their need for a relationship with God so that they wouldn't do just like Adam and Eve said, hey, you know what? Thank you, God, but I think we got it from here. It would have been so easy for the Israelites to sit at the bank of the Red Sea and say, I'm pretty sure we just made that happen. I think that all 1 million of us kind of standing on the shore shifted the sands, caused the Red Sea to split apart, dried up the ground, made the wind blow, made this giant wall, and then when we crossed, it came back together. I'm pretty sure we made that happen. It would have been so easy for them to sit at the banks of the shore and say, oh, we got this. Hey, God, thanks for getting us this far. That was totally you that did that, but we got it from here on out. It's the same stuff that Adam and Eve did, and it's the same thing that we did. God gave the law as the confirmation of this relationship that he had for them, but also to point out their sin. Because the reality is that in a relationship with God, sin must be dealt with. Sin must be dealt with. This is not 2025 kosher language. Because we like to have our Jesus and we like to have our sin too. Even within the church. If you're watching online this morning and you're like, I would never go to a church because they're just hypocrites, same reality. I don't like the church because we're full of hypocrites too. Because we like our Jesus and we like our sin. Maybe that's just me. Maybe it's just a pastoral thing. I like my Jesus and I like my sin. No, the reality is that is so true and why we need Jesus. Because the law pointed out that we had sin and taught us what to do with that so that when Jesus showed up on the scene, he could be the perfect fulfillment of everything that we cannot do. So God gives the law as these provisions, and he says sin has to be dealt with. Why? Because God is a holy God. God is perfect, and in him cannot be where there is sin. There's this wall of division that gets created because of our sin, because of our rebellion, because of our choices to live contrary to God's law. The holiness of God and the sinfulness of humanity creates a fundamental problem that sin separates us from God. The law made this reality unmistakably clear. For every law broken, for every impure thought, for every unjust action, there was a barrier placed between the people and their Creator. If you've been in Exodus, I want to encourage you to turn to the third book of the Old Testament, Leviticus. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. And Leviticus and Numbers are oftentimes where if you are a person who said, I'm going to read the whole Bible, and you start at the beginning, Leviticus and Numbers is probably about where you stopped. Because it gets foreign to us, and it gets weird. So I want to invite you to turn to Leviticus chapter 16. Chapter 16 and chapter 17 are understandably and agreeably weird, except for when we say, God, I want to understand this and how this impacts my understanding of who Jesus is. Leviticus chapter 16, verses 1 and 2 says, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they approached the Lord. There's a lot more to that story. If you want to read earlier in Leviticus, you can understand. But the reality is, God in his holiness, God in his perfection, when they tried to bypass God's law and be with God in his perfection, it caused their death. The Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or else he will die. for I will appear in the cloud over the atonement cover. Verse 3, this is how Aaron is to enter the most holy place. He must first bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He is to put on the sacred linen tunic with the linen undergarments next to his body. He is to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. They are sacred garments. So he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Again, this isn't your normal 2025 cooking list. This isn't our normal dressing list. Nobody probably thought about whether they were wearing linen, cotton, or wool this morning. Verse 6, Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. So understandably, this is different. Oftentimes we read this, if we're reading chronologically, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, we get to this and we're like, I don't know what to do with this. Does God want me to only wear linen clothes? Does God want me to get some goats? I don't understand. And so we give up. But it's this picture of the sacrificial system that sin has to be dealt with. In the Garden of Eden, because of Adam and Eve's sin, God had to exclude them out of the garden. They were kicked out of this perfect garden in which they were placed because of their sin. Now God has stepped into the Israelite story. He's never moved, but he's restoring them back. He's doing this work of restoration. And so he says, rather than every time you sin, you have to be kicked out of the community again. No, instead I'm going to provide for you, because I know that as you see your sin due to the law, as you see the reality of the ways that you rebel against me, there's going to be sin that you have to deal with. And instead of kicking you out every time, let's make a provision for that. Oh, you can't provide for yourself, so God, the one that you just rebelled against, is going to provide for you. Are you wrapping your minds around the goodness of God at display in this? But he says, here's the provisions. This is not something to take lightly, so much so that when Aaron steps in to make this sacrifice for the people, for the Israelites, he's supposed to do this very thoughtfully, very intentionally. This is a time and a thing that is set apart. There's preparation that goes into it, because this is an incredible thing that is happening. He says, this is what Aaron has to do. This is the sacrificial system. That when Aaron goes first, he has to make atonement for himself. Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin, to make atonement for himself and his household. I get to stand up here every Sunday morning. And oftentimes I wear a button down the front shirt. And when I don't wear a button down the front shirt, people get all confused, because last week I wore a polo and people were like, you look like Pastor Marty, but I'm not quite sure. I like to have my image put together. And I'm okay this side of the cross because of my relationship with Jesus. I'm okay confessing that I have sin, because I just told you I like having my Jesus, and unfortunately I like having my sin too. But if I'm honest with you this morning, if everybody walked out the door this morning as you've heard the sermon and you're like, it wasn't your best, even if that was your honest feedback, that would cut me down. Why? Because I place my value in what other people think. God starts with Aaron, doesn't he? Aaron is the high priest. Aaron is the one who gets to spiritually care for all of the Israelites. And Aaron has to first deal with his own sin. Sometimes that's hard, is to admit that we have sin in our own lives. We're good about dealing with everybody else's sin and showing them what they should do. But God says, hey, Aaron, let it start with you. Why don't you start by confessing that you don't try and play this game that you think, oh, you know what? I've got this thing figured out. This is why when Jesus shows up on the scene, he's so angry at the Pharisees, because they weren't doing what Aaron was doing. The Pharisees are like, we got this figured out. We don't really need this Jesus. We don't really need this death and resurrection. We don't need that hope, because we're good enough. God says, let it start with Aaron. He needs to have atonement made for him too. It's going to come through this bowl. Then they're to take 2 goats, present them to the Lord. One will be sacrificed. The blood will cover the sin. The blood of the one goat will cover the sin. Our sin has to be dealt with. The result of all sin is death. And so God provided for them in the way that out of one goat's death, the blood would be shed to cover that sin. But then, here's the fun. Here's where we miss in Leviticus chapter 16, is the other one. He says, I'm going to place the sin on this goat, and then where does he do with the goat? Sends it out. Because God is saying, this sin ruins the relationship between us and God. Our sin ruins our relationship between us and God. The sin of the Israelites ruined the relationship between them and God. It couldn't be there, and the sacrifice covered that. But also, sin ravages our communities as well, doesn't it? It impacts the way that we relate with one another. He says, so ceremonially, we're going to transfer the sin onto this goat. We're going to send it out of the community. We're going to get rid of it. It's going to be gone. But this only can happen once a year. Because while God provided for this, there was limits to what it could be. The signpost in the 4077 said, hey, it's this far to Boston, but that wasn't Boston. It said it's this far to Tokyo, but that wasn't Cleveland. It pointed them in the direction, but it was limited. The law was limited. It pointed to something that would be better, not this once-a-year atonement, not this once-a-year placing of the sin and getting it out of the community. It was pointing to the ways that Jesus would come. Jesus who would, in his death, cover our sin, pay the penalty for our sin, and he would also serve as the scapegoat, the one who would root out the sin out of our community and out of us. Jesus being the perfect sacrifice. Jesus serving in this role of Aaron as the high priest. Jesus being our atonement. Galatians 3:24, the Apostle Paul will write this, so then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. If you ever struggled with a class in school, you might have had a tutor. Well, that tutor helps you to understand, but they're not the ones grading you. They're not the ones that you have to ultimately perform for. They're helping you to understand it. That's what the law was doing. The law was serving as this guardian and this tutor, showing us that Jesus was coming. Jesus, the one who would ultimately fulfill this role. The law foreshadowed the coming of Christ. And from the sacrificial system to the priesthood, every element of the law pointed toward Jesus. The sacrifices made foreshadowed his death. The priests foreshadowed his role as our mediator. And the festivals that they celebrated foreshadowed the redemption that he would bring. Jesus says, I did not come to abolish this, but to fulfill this. I came to step into your mess, to take on the penalty for your sin on your behalf, and to lead you into this good news. Because the reality is that the cross reveals God's justice and God's love working together. The law only showed us how much we had messed up. If we were still here this morning and there was no Jesus on the scene, there was no Jesus who in his death and his resurrection changed our story, we would be under the condemnation of the law that would continually point out our sin. And the best that we could hope for is that once a year we'd be straight up with God, but about 30 seconds later we'd be stuck again. But Jesus in his death covers our sin, past, present, and future. And he leads us into a new way of relating with God, because the cross reveals God's justice and his love that work together. See, justice says that sin must be punished. There's no opportunity for God to say, hey, you know what? Your sin's okay, we'll just let it slide this time. No, that would ruin the character of who God is. It would ruin his goodness. So God says sin must be punished, there must be justice, but because of his love for us, he provides a way for us to be saved. So when we look at the cross and we look at the law, we see that this law served as the signpost of God saying something better is coming, that Jesus would bore the full punishment of our sin that we deserved. He would be God's justice, and that he would die willingly out of his love for us, extending God's mercy and his grace for us. The law served as a mirror that reflected our inability to live up to God's perfect standards. It made clear that no one could keep the law perfectly. No human being could achieve righteousness through their own efforts. That wasn't God's intent for giving the law to his people. Remember, it was a confirmation of a relationship, in that he wasn't saying, hey, do all these things and you'll be righteous. He's saying, this is what it would look like. You can't do this, so I'm going to provide a way for you temporarily, and Jesus is coming. God in his justice, God in his mercy, and God in his love reveals his heart for us. God's justice and his love functioning together in our lives as well. God's justice does not contradict his mercy and his love. Rather, they work in perfect harmony to bring us to salvation. Living in this tension means understanding that God's justice demands that sin be dealt with, but his mercy provides a way for us to be given through Jesus Christ. As believers, we're called to live in a way that reflects both of these attributes by living justly and showing mercy and love to others. Friends, the reality is, if you're here this morning and you've not received what Christ has done on the cross, you still live under the law. Because the law was given before Jesus shows up on the scene. And if you've rejected that Jesus showed up on the scene and serves in that capacity as both the sacrificial goat and the scapegoat, setting you free from the penalty of your sin and also desiring to take your sin away from you, so that more and more each day you're saying, I don't like my sin as much, and I like Jesus more. I'm not placing as many things on the throne where God belongs, and instead I'm worshiping God. That is the desire of the law, and that is the desire of what Jesus does, is that he transforms us. Because the reality is that Jesus could do what the law could never do. Jesus transforms us where the law could only point out our failings. So God's not stuck there. God's not stuck pointing out our sin over and over and over to us. Instead, he says, I'm going to point out your sin and I'm going to provide for you through Jesus so that you can be transformed. Friends, that's a reality that each of us, even those of us walking in relationship with God, need in our daily life. Is for Jesus to continue to transform us over and over. But if you've never said yes to Jesus, to allow him to begin the work of transformation that he desires to do in your heart and your life, friends, may today be the day where you recognize the hope that you have, and may you have a true heart-to-heart conversation with God and say, God, I surrender. I could never live up to the standard, and instead I receive what you have offered through Jesus.